Welcome back to another Destiny 2 video. Today's video is a Prismatic Hunter build that I wanted to showcase just in time for Rite of the 9. This is a Hunter build focusing on boss DPS and having insane survivability, mainly designed around dungeon and raid encounters, but is generally applicable for a lot of different content. Seeing how strong a lot of different parts of Titan and Warlock have been this season, I got a lot of comments asking about what to really run for Hunter, especially stuff that wasn't Celestial Nighthawk or Still Hunt focused for weapon rotations. And so this is what I put together, and I gotta say, this is kind of my go-to and has been for a while now for Hunter DPS on all different kinds of encounters. The background gameplay speaks for itself, so let's get right into the build and start off on the subclass. Starting off on Prismatic Hunter. For your super, go with Golden Gun Marksman. There really isn't anything stopping you from using any of the other supers, but again, being boss DPS focused, Golden Gun Marksman is the objective best choice in my opinion. In addition, when combined with our Fragment, Facet of Purpose, it allows us to get Restoration with this build, which really helps with the survivability. So in my opinion, Golden Gun Marksman is the way to go. For your abilities, go with Gambler's Dodge to refresh your melee ability, and for that melee ability, go with Snare Bomb. Now, Snare Bomb might be the most offensively limited melee ability here on Prismatic Hunter, but it is an absolute monster when it comes to boss DPS scenarios, and the main reason for that is because thanks to Facet of Dawn, it becomes one of the only abilities in the entire game to debuff and buff all in one go. Snare Bomb is intrinsically weakening, so that means that we have a ranged, weakening, and radiant proc all off of one ability. And of course, whenever we pop Transcendence with this build, we can continuously regen the Snare Bomb, meaning we have constant weakening and radiant procs over and over and over again. It's an incredibly valuable DPS tool that is an absolute must for this build. Onto your grenade, go with Grapple Grenade. The main reason behind this is that Grapple Grenade is not only a grenade charge, but also acts as a melee charge when you use the Unraveling melee while you're grappling. This effect can be combined with stuff like Facet of Mending and Facet of Dawn, allowing our grenade to activate as an additional Facet of Dawn reproc, giving us Radiant, but also granting us Cure on any final blows we get with our grapple melee. In addition, it's nice to have a movement tool that also works really well with Ascension, but keep in mind, you could technically use any grenade with this build because this build has great customization with it. And no matter what grenade you use, you'll actually get Woven Mail intrinsically with this build because of the other perk on our Exotic Cloak. So no matter which grenade you use, you're also getting additional survivability. But again, I like Grapple Grenade because not only does it act as a nice movement tool, but it also can work with proccing Radiant, is very easy to proc Facet of Mending with, and again with our setup, it'll grant us Woven Mail when we activate it. So if we have a Tangle that we spawn in, for instance, we can grapple to that Tangle repeatedly and continually proc Woven Mail with this setup. Next up onto the aspects, the first one is Stylish Executioner, which summed up, anytime you get an elemental defeat against an enemy, it will turn you invisible, and again, any elemental defeat. In addition, when you're invisible and you melee an enemy, it'll also weaken that enemy for you. And although that's not primarily what we're using it for, it's just another source for weakening and raw utility, which is always appreciated on builds like this. We're pairing Stylish Executioner with Ascension, and Ascension has gone from a pretty mediocre exotic in my opinion to being an absolute must for PvE Prismatic Hunter. Summarized, while we're in the air, we can consume our class ability and have a jolting upward thrust that amplifies you and jolts nearby targets. Amplified is an absolute beast in PvE. Not only does it give you a base 15% damage resist, but it also makes enemies less accurate when they're fighting you, so it just helps with the raw survivability of this build by giving you more damage resistance and just making you harder to hit. In addition, it also jolts nearby targets, which of course counts as an elemental debuff, which means it can easily proc Stylish Executioner and works really nicely with each other. Next up are the fragments, and the first one is Facet of Dawn, giving us Radiant on powered melee hits. This basically means that anytime that we damage an enemy with our Snare Bomb or with our grapple melee, this will give us Radiant for free. Radiant is extremely powerful with this build, not only because it gives your weapons a 25% damage bonus that stacks with our exotics damage bonus, but also because Radiant will also empower Golden Gun Marksman to deal more damage. We're also combining this with Facet of Protection, giving us more damage resistance when we're surrounded by combatants. Facet of Protection works really well when combined with our other intrinsic damage resist, like our Woven Mail effects, or amplified through Ascension for example, and even popping Transcendence, this effect is increased. In fact, the maximum damage resistance we can achieve with this build is 88%, which is just shy of stronghold levels of damage resistance. And again, it's a completely offensive focused build, and you can have this kind of survivability all while dealing damage. The next fragment is Facet of Hope, which gives us an increase to our class ability regen rate anytime we have an elemental buff. So again, with stuff like Amplified basically always being active, or stuff like Woven Mail, or Radiant, or invisibility, for example, we can basically always have this effect up, giving us a permanent 60% increase to our class ability regen, which works really nicely when combined with Ascension's effects. The next fragment is Passive Mending, which I touched on earlier, giving us Cure on Grenade Final Blows, which again can work with our Grapple Grenade very nicely, as well as our Transcendence Grenade. And the final one is Passive Purpose, and this kind of rounds out the survivability of this whole setup. We do have some incredible damage resistance, and Passive Purpose lets us get healing on top of it. Basically, anytime we pick up an Orb of Power, it'll grant us restoration thanks to our super. This is again another reason why Golden Gun Marksman is very important for this build. Next up, onto the artifact mods, and I'm mainly going to go over the mods that are really relevant to this setup, so keep in mind there is a lot of room for customization if you want to change things around. The first mod is Unraveling Orbs, which anytime we pick up an Orb of Power or a Tangle, it gives our strand weapons unraveling rounds. And the boost with this is that strand weapons deal increased damage to strand debuff targets. The main reason we're using this artifact perk is because of the unraveling effect it grants our strand weapons, which applying unraveling to a boss will be a form of passive damage as you deal other forms of damage. And again, if you wanted to use a strand weapon with this build, you can get an additional damage boost from it, and again, there's no real restrictions behind doing that. Just switch out the elemental specific mods in the armor set for it, and you're set. The next mod we're using is Dielectric, which anytime we defeat an arc debuff target, it grants us a stack of Bolt Charge, and with the boost, anytime we rapidly defeat these arc debuff targets, it grants us a free Orb of Power and a small bit of health. So again, with something like Ascension jolting a lot of enemies in a big AoE effect, this is a very strong perk when combined with it, granting us essentially a free Orb of Power and health anytime we use Ascension. The next mod I'm going over is Flashover, which gives us Amplified anytime we hit maximum stacks of Bolt Charge, and the other effect is when we actually generate that Bolt Charge strike, it causes that Lightning Strike to deal 150% more damage. So overall, it just gives us another way to become amplified and strengthens the effects of Bolt Charge. The next mod is Horde Shuttle. Damaging unraveled targets with a weapon occasionally will spawn a Threadling, and the boost to this is that Threadlings sever targets that they damage. This is a very nice synergetic combo because simply dealing damage to an already unraveled target will generate these Threadlings, and these Threadlings can go out and sever nearby enemies and deal even additional damage to that same target. And we're taking Horde Shuttle along with Unraveling Orbs and combining it with 2 Shreds. In short, dealing sustained damage to a severed target will unravel them, giving us a free way to unravel targets, and defeating severed targets gives us a Strand Hotspot. Summed up, whenever you walk into that Strand Hotspot, you get Woven Mail and a small bit of health. So again, simply picking up an Orb of Power or a Tangle gives us Unraveling Orbs, which can unravel targets. Damaging those unraveled targets will spawn in Threadlings that can sever targets, and then damaging those severed targets will then cause them to not only unravel if they aren't already, but also generate Woven Mail and healing spots for us on defeat. The next mod I'm going over is Limit Break, which gives us a 30% damage increase when we cast our super while we're critically wounded, or have an elemental buff matching our super. In our case, if we're using a solar super, we need a solar buff, which counts as Radiant, Restoration, or Cure. And of course, with this build, we can achieve all 3 very easily, and so this is basically a free 30% damage boost. I'm also pairing this with Dreadful Finisher just to help us generate a lot of special ammo, because the special ammo I'm using today is the main focus of the build. With that said though, if you wanted to, there's a lot of room for customization in the final column. Again, Limit Break is primarily there because we're using Golden Gun Marksman as our super. If you wanted to go with something like Deadfall Tether, for example, and have a more utility-focused super, you could also swap this out for, say, something like Defibrillating Blast if you want to spec into arc weapons, or Void Flux if you want to spec into a void weapon, for example. There's a lot of customization here to play with. Again, I'm mainly focusing this, though, if we're using Golden Gun Marksman as our super, and if we're benefiting with a strand weapon specifically, as I believe it's the best combination. Next up, into the armor and the mods for today. On our helmet, we have a stack of Strand Siphon, just allowing our strand weapon to periodically generate an Orb of Power, which again, when picked up, will help those strand weapons have unraveling rounds. I'm also pairing it with a stack of Special and Heavy Ammo Finder just to benefit the weapons for this build, as again, it's primarily a weapon-focused DPS setup. For the gauntlets, I'm going with a stack of Impact Induction and Momentum Transfer, just allowing our grenade and melee to help regen one another a little bit when we deal damage with them. And I'm also pairing this with a loader mod to benefit our DPS weapon, which in this case is Lord of Wolves, which I'll go over a little bit later. For the chest piece, like I always say, any combination of reserves or resists is perfectly fine. It's entirely dependent upon the enemies you're fighting and the content you're in. There's something to note though, that with this build, we already have such great damage resistance at base that it's actually okay to spec into reserves primarily rather than resistance mods. But again, it's entirely dependent upon what you want to do. And for our legs, we have first a Scavenger mod to again benefit the DPS weapon we're using, as well as a stack of Absolution and Recuperation. Absolution is going to give us ability energy across the board when we pick up an Orb of Power, and Recuperation is going to give us a small amount of health when we pick up that orb. And again, keep in mind, with stuff like Facet of Purpose, picking up that orb also gives us restoration on top of it, and it also gives unraveling to our strand weapons, so picking up an orb of power is incredibly valuable with the setup. Now something you might be wondering is if this is a build primarily focused on weapon DPS, why we don't have any surges on our legs. And the main reason behind that is because our cloak actually does a better job of that for us. Spirit of Foe Tracer is the first perk on our exotic for today, which is relativism. And Spirit of Foe Tracer is fantastic specifically for Prismatic Hunter, because anytime that we deal ability damage against a boss, the affinity of that ability damage gives us a 4-time surge for 16 seconds. What that means is that for 16 seconds, we have a 25% damage boost for weapons matching the elemental affinity of the ability we just deal damage with. So for our case, we can use stuff like Golden Gun Marksman as our super. Dealing damage with Golden Gun Marksman then gives us a 25% solar weapon damage boost for 16 seconds. And again, it's a 4-time surge at 25%, which means it beats out having 3 surge mods here at 22%. And something else to note about Foe Tracer is that you can actually multi-stack this effect across multiple abilities. It was something that we really couldn't see too well before because it was kind of hard to have another subclass deal another subclass's ability type, but now with Prismatic we can do that all the time. So if you wanted to, you could have stuff like Solar Surge and Arc Surge and Void Surge all active on all of your weapons at the exact same time. You can build into the setup with a wide variety of elemental affinity of weapons and still have these same surge effects benefit all of them. And with having Prismatic Hunter have a lot of good ability spam, specifically when Transcendence is active, this plays in really nicely to the damage boosting effects, allowing us to keep those damage boosts up constantly with this build. The other perk on relativism is Spirit of Katarkany. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, probably not, but basically whenever you use your grenade charge, it gives you Woven Mail. This is very similar to the exotic it's pulling the trait from, but what makes it actually better than the base exotic on Prismatic specifically is that it's not just limited to your grapple grenade. You can use any grenade with Spirit of Katarkany and have basically no downsides to it, and that includes your Hellfire Spike grenade when you pop Transcendence. So again, it works with any grenade, and especially during Transcendence, you can proc that over and over again and constantly have Woven Mail. And when you're using your abilities a lot, especially during Transcendence, you're also dealing ability damage, which can proc Spirit of Foe Tracer for a wide variety of elemental affinities. As far as the mods on the cloak go, there really isn't a lot to choose from because there's just not much that really works too well. Stuff like Time Dilation is normally a really good thing for weapon surges, but it doesn't work with Foe Tracer, so we don't really need it. Stuff like Reaper, Distribution, and Powerful Attraction don't have perfect synergy with Ascension, and that's something they've stated they're looking into, but it makes stuff like this in the context of the build kind of underwhelming, so I'm mainly throwing on a stack of Reaper, and in case we do benefit from it, hey, we get a free Orb of Power. And the main 2 mods I'm focusing on using are Special Finisher and Proximity Ward, mainly to give us an overshield while performing a finisher, and this is another way that we can generate special ammo with our finisher if we needed to, primarily since our special weapon is the weapon we're focusing on dealing DPS with. And while we're here, as far as the stat investment goes, as always, resilience is number 1 in PvE. Having more resilience makes you stronger against all forms of damage, makes you have a lot better survivability. Tier 10 resilience is your number 1 goal. Besides resilience, the other stat distributions you might want to go for are discipline in my opinion, just because having our grenade back as fast as possible is a key component of this build, not only giving us Woven Mail, but specifically with our grapple grenade, acting as a way for us to get Cure and Radiant off of that single proc. The only stats I really wouldn't worry about with this setup are mobility and recovery, mainly because mobility just isn't necessary with this setup. We already have a base 60% increase to our class ability regen, and so investing significantly into mobility is kind of pointless in my opinion, and recovery just isn't necessary because of how good the survivability of the setup is. Finally, onto the weapons, and 2 things before I get into them. First, yes, Lord of Wolves is getting nerfed on May 6th. It is a 30% damage nerf because Lord of Wolves currently is just one of the best weapons in the entire sandbox, period. It is basically the go-to weapon right now because of how strong it is. Even with a 30% damage nerf, it'll still be one of the strongest sustained DPS exotics in the entire game, really only being beat out by stuff like Legend of Acreus, for example. So with that in mind, it won't be as strong as some of the clips you're seeing here, but it'll still be a monster in PvE in general. And again, a 30% damage nerf really isn't that much whenever you were completely obliterating every other exotic in the sandbox and most DPS weapon rotations. And the second thing is, like I mentioned earlier, you can use any weapon combination you would ever want to with this build. So for example, if they end up like doubling the nerf for Lord of Wolves and it ends up being a lot worse than what we initially predicted, you can just simply use a different weapon. You can use Choir of One, you can use Queenbreaker, you can use Whisper of the Worm, you can use stuff like Thunderlord for just very basic damage if you wanted to. This build is so open to customization that even if this specific weapon gets hit a lot harder than what they've said it's going to be, you have options to use anything that you want. And this specific combination, based on what we know, will still be incredibly strong. So specifically for my loadout, again, Lord of Wolves is the primary focus. You basically put whatever you don't want to be alive anymore in the center of your screen, hold down a button and hit fire, and it just gets deleted. It's absolutely insane. Even with the 30% nerf, it'll still be insanely good. This is still the loadout I will be using after Lord of Wolves gets hit, and this is the exact loadout I will be taking into Rite of the 9 for all 3 dungeons. For a kinetic weapon, the strand weapon is again there to chain all the different strand effects I went over earlier. Mirror and Mago is nothing special necessarily. You can use any strand weapon you would want to, even stuff like the new strand trace rifle from the Sunder Doctrine dungeon if you wanted to, and that will work fine. Any strand weapon works perfectly fine with this setup. Again, it's mainly there to proc those strand effects and give us a way to generate even more orbs of power. Again, the heavy weapon is entirely dependent upon you. Literally any heavy weapon works. And I know that might not be the best in terms of like recommending things, but again, Foe Tracer just kind of gives anything that damage boost because of what is available to it with Prismatic Hunter's kit. I do want to highlight something though, which is Temptation's Hook, specifically in the context of close range DPS with Lord of Wolves. Temptation's Hook is kind of underwhelming in terms of its raw DPS profile, and so we're not really using this to damage bosses. We're using this to print orbs like crazy with attrition orbs. And in the background gameplay, you can see how many orbs we're generating with this thing and how we can easily keep up our survivability by occasionally swapping to this in boss DPS scenarios and hitting them with a heavy attack. When we combine Temptation's Hook, specifically with attrition orbs, and the Power of Ambition weapon mod, it allows this thing to generate so many orbs and allows us to have that great survivability even at a close range. And again, picking up those orbs grants us Unraveling and all the effects benefited from that, specifically with the Artifact mod, with stuff like To Shreds or Horde Shuttle, as well as benefiting us with stuff like Ability Regen and Small Health Pickup, as well as proccing stuff like Restoration for the pure survivability of this build. I do want to note that if you're going to swap out Temptation's Hook for a more DPS focused heavy weapon, stuff like Velocity Baton still exists as a great way to generate a ton of orbs on hit with attrition orbs. And so the orb printing effects and the benefits this build gets with something like Temptation's Hook can still be found on stuff like Velocity Baton or even some other weapons with attrition orbs. You have a ton of options to choose from. All in all, guys, that's the build for today. This has kind of been my go-to hunter build for a lot of different content over the past couple weeks, and I'm glad that now I've gotten a chance to kind of iron it out and perfect it here and there, that I've been able to share it with you guys. Dim link, as always, is down in the description below, so feel free to try this build out for yourself. I hope you have as much fun with it as I've been having, and let me know down in the comments below what you thought of the build for today. And just as a sneak peek, in case you've noticed from the background gameplay, I've been using this in a lot of different dungeons. That's because I'm currently assembling a solo flawless dungeon guide for all 3 characters across every single dungeon in the game. So stay tuned for that sometime in the near future. With that said, thank you guys so much for watching. I greatly appreciate your continued support on these build guides, and as always, have a great day.